Hello, I'm Meri Fatin and welcome to Cover to Cover. On this program we meet the authors of the latest West Australian books. The show is presented by Writing WA, the peak body for writing and related activities in Western Australia. My guest today is award-winning science fiction fantasy author Lee Battersby, who's recently published his first book for children, Magret. Thanks for being here, Lee.
Thank you for having me.
I thought we'd start today by you telling us the outline of the story of Magret.
Magret is the story of a 10-year-old girl who lives in a cemetery that has no entrance and no exit. One day the stork drops a baby into the cemetery, and despite all the advice and warnings from her friend and mentor, Master Puppet, who's a skeleton that she built to keep her company, she decides that she's going to keep it and raise the baby.
And what's really interesting is that there is a truth that you've built this story around that came from your reading of Catherine Arnold's Necropolis. Tell me a bit more about that.
That's right, yes. Necropolis is a book about the funerary history of London. And in one chapter, Catherine Arnold, the author, described a survey that took place in the 18th century at the point where they were considering moving all the cemeteries out from the urban areas. And they discovered that in many cases London had grown so quickly that the urban sprawl had actually fully enclosed the cemeteries. So in order to even access the little chapel cemeteries to do a count of the graves or the bodies interred there, they had to dig through decades of refuse. So they had to actually carve tunnels through these piles, these mountains of rubbish and detritus. So from there it was a very short leap to the idea that, well, what if they couldn't? What if there was this cemetery that was completely closed in? And what happened if someone fell into that and couldn't get out?
It was an extraordinary setting, most definitely. And so what you're saying is that what they were finding was something way more buried than what your setting is in Magret.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
They came equipped to sort of dig graves and count graves and had to do a lot more digging than they'd expected just to get there.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Yeah. Now, the way this story developed is really interesting because it was tested on a nightly basis as it was in development. Tell me that story.
Yeah, my son, who was 7 or 8 at the time, he suffered from a condition called rumination syndrome, which is best described as uncontrolled vomiting. So he was vomiting 50 or 60 times a day. Could not go to school under those circumstances. Could almost not leave the house for a couple of years. So it became something that he was able to look forward to. Days were very physically demanding for him, very sort of psychologically demanding. And so every day at the end of the day before bedtime, we'd sit around and we'd read a little bit of the story as I wrote it. So I'd come home from work, I'd write a little bit, we'd read to him, to both the kids, and then the next day we'd go again. So.
Yeah, and because he had a date with that story every night, you were under the pump, I guess, to deliver.
Yeah,
weren't
I had
you?
to deliver. It was a day when I didn't have anything to read. It was a big disappointment. I had to keep him happy. Yeah.
And so, how much would you be able to deliver on a single night? A few hundred words? Or?
Yeah, a couple of hundred words. I mean, the more you write, the deeper you get into the story. I think the quicker the words come. So, if we got 400 or 500 words, that wasn't bad.
And did he give you feedback along the way about the way the story was developing? And
yeah, he's not shy, my boy. So yeah, I mean, there was always a lot of guessing and a lot of I wonder what happens next, and I think it translated to the pace of the story because every night I had to deliver something to have that reaction of, now what? Oh no, I need to know. And so I think despite the fact that the story's largely 2 or 3 voices in an enclosed space, there's a lot goes on. There's constant action, largely because I've got to keep a little guy happy at the end of every night.
I read it aloud to my 7-year-old, and I wanted to tell you this because not all books are like this. It was beautiful to read aloud.
Oh, thank you.
And I was interested to know, how obviously you were reading aloud as you went, which is probably unique in terms of developing a story. But there is some background in your life that kind of makes you better at writing books for reading aloud.
Yeah, I spent a couple of years as a stand-up comedian, a bad stand-up comedian in the early 90s, so in my early 20s. And of course, like anybody who's been on the stage in any way, you rehearse, you speak it aloud, you act it out, you do all the movements and the voices, and so that aspect of reading a written work comes reasonably naturally. And then I'm trying to entertain a couple of kids who are brought up on superhero movies and role-playing games, so silly voices and acting out and making people laugh and poo jokes and all come as part of the territory.
There are no poo jokes in Magret.
There's a lot of poo jokes in Magret. There's a whole chapter of them.
To go back and read it with different ears. Let's talk about death and dying in children's books, because I get the impression that you think that we're worse now than we ever have been at broaching that topic with children.
I don't know if we're worse than we ever have been. I think obviously infant mortality in our nice, comfortable Western world, at least, is lower than it's ever been, historically speaking. I think some of I'll say taboos, but I think we're protected from infant mortality much more than even in my mother was born. In fact, both my parents were born during the war, so death was at least a daily potential even for them. And I think that maybe we do have a certain awkwardness about the topic. I think we do delay the exposure. And I'm not saying that that's wrong or anything, but I do think that, and I've always felt that children are really very good and very brave about exploring their emotions and exploring their reactions to things. And so I think that an exploration of death or an exploration of illness or serious topics of those regard are something that the children can actually take on and actually handle. And obviously with this particular novel there is an exploration of that. It's fairly light and it's handled, I hope, with light touch. But I don't think it's anything that should be shied away from when talking to a child.
Did this subject matter engender some interesting conversations between you and your son as you were developing the story? Yeah,
because he was very sick, genuinely sick, and there were days, even at 7 or 8, where he actually thought he was going to die. So it became a topic of conversation. He also became fairly fearless in talking to doctors because he got to speak to a lot of them. So he also became a kind of fearless person. He would ask those questions of medical professionals and sort of he would understand when he was being patronised, I guess, in many ways. So, it was part of his maturation process. Yeah.
So, is writing about death and dying necessarily sad?
No, not at all. Without giving too much away, there's obviously an element of sadness. My daughter, her birth mother died when she was 4 days old, so she's grown up with that knowledge. Hasn't affected her at all. She's a beautiful, light, happy, wonderful 14-year-old now. It becomes assimilated into a worldview. So it's purely like anything else, I guess. It's when the moment is appropriate to talk about it. That is the right time.
So what kind of experience, I don't even know if you've really thought about this, but what kind of experience do you hope or anticipate that readers will have from reading Magret?
I hope the kids who read it think, oh my God, that's the saddest book I've ever read. I must read more. It is a sad book. It's a very sad book. But I think it's sad in a safe way, in a good way, in that it's a sad experience that the child reader can close the page on, talk about with their parent, assimilate, come to understand, read on again, and then there's some moments of absolutely wonderful happiness in there as well. And I think the ending of the book is actually an extremely happy ending, probably the happiest ending I've written as well, because I've written mainly for adults before, and I've always tended to write fairly downbeat, horrible endings for my characters. Whereas this is, I think, quite uplifting and happy. So there's a great payoff at the end, I hope.
I think that's going to be the greatest temptation anybody watching this could have, is to read the saddest book they've ever read with the happiest ending ever.
Yeah, skip to the
How
end.
does that work?
I can't give anything away, otherwise
you
it becomes a spoiler. But it's a sense of growth, a sense of taking on a responsibility or taking on a knowledge of oneself, and from that knowledge comes opportunity, comes a chance to grow further and to become a different person. So, you know, at the end of the novel, the characters involve, all of them kind of leave a cocoon in a certain way and discover far greater opportunities than they'd ever allowed themselves to discover.
I'm really interested that, I mean, up until this point in your career, you'd written for adults.
Yeah.
So was this book a children's book because of the circumstances in which you wrote it?
I think so. I had the idea to write the novel a couple of years before I did, at which point I had tried to write it as an adult novel, tried to put an adult into that environment, and it simply didn't work. And I think the reason it simply didn't work is that there was no way to stop an adult leaving the environment. You know, an adult would knock on the window or climb out, or there needed to be that sense of, in certain cases, in certain ways, helplessness. There needed to be a sense that the person at the centre of the story, the protagonist, would accept this very enclosed world as the totality of the world, the sum of the world. And the more I worked with that, and the more the younger Magret became. And in the end it fits. The story fits as a child's story. And I never, when I first started out writing, intended to be purely a speculative fiction writer or purely a writer for adults. So the idea that this actually now was a story about a child and it was going to be a kid's book didn't faze me at all. It was something I hadn't written before, but there was no reason not to.
And you were very keen to make sure that you weren't talking down to your audience, though, were you? That you see, a bloody-minded refusal not to simplify your techniques, I think, is what you told me. That's such a writer, darling.
But yeah, the children's writers that I read when I was trying to get a sense of tone and a sense of an understanding of the form, because it was quite different for me to writing adult works. My natural inclinations, I guess, led me to Roald Dahl, Lemony Snicket, writers who didn't do that, who did not talk down to their audience, who were unafraid to use sophisticated words and sophisticated concepts, who were unrepentant in leaving the darkness into the stories.
Well, the way Roald Dahl writes is almost as if conspiratorially, with the children being the ones who actually know what's going on in the world.
The kids are the smart ones, and yes, he's sort of cluing them into that as much as he's agreeing with them. Particularly in Dahl's writing, there's a real sense of, you're better than this, you're smarter than them, come on, you could rule the world, and everyone will have bubble gum. And I like that, and I've got 2 children of my own. I've got 3 bonus kids who grew up with me, and I always thought they're brilliant people. I've loved them as kids, and I love them growing up, and so never at any stage felt that I had to be their superior or their educator or any of that ilk. We just did silly things together and grew up together, so that was a natural tone for me. As an artist, as an author, I don't exist to educate your children or someone else's children. There are people who are in perfectly good positions to do that. I'm here to educate them and make them think they're fabulous. So entertain them, I should say, and make them think they're fabulous. So part of that was, talking to them as if they're fully capable people who have brilliant ideas, which they do.
You told me that in its earlier stages, Magret was more absurd than the final story, and I'm really interested in some of the conversations that you must have had with your editor around leaps of faith in this story.
Yeah, my own inner goon show was writ large, I think, earlier on. So, yeah, it was really quite absurd and lots of silliness and my editor at Walker, Sue Whiting, was very involved in saying, look, the more you ground it in reality, the more it feels real, the more those fantastical elements, the more that the talking skeleton and the baby being dropped from a stork, and ghost voices and secret places and so forth, they will feel real too. The absurdity is fun, but it's not real. And so the more we grounded it in a very real sense, that this was a very real place, a very real time, I think those fantastical elements then feel more real. And so the emotions that the reader goes through then feel more real as well. So she was smarter than me, damn it.
Yeah. And did you, were there elements of it that you really fought hard not to let go of, in terms of having to make them feasible when you really didn't want them to be?
Yeah, there are a couple of places where I won. But in the main, I was fortunate. Sue's a very, very good editor. And it's very hard to argue with a very, very good editor, because they do know better than you. Yeah. I wrote a story that was fantastic for me and fantastic for my kids, and it entertained us all, and we had a wonderful time. Sue took that and turned it into a novel that will speak to more people than just me and my absurd kids.
Yeah. Talking about speaking to people, I was looking on your blog, and you were laughing about the fact that there'd been one very specific recommendation about the book being suitable for, I think, girls in year 5 and 6 or something like that. But did you have an age group in mind when you were writing it even?
No. Every time I've tried to write for a particular market, I've written something horrible that sounds like tin, I guess. The best I can do is tell the story. And the story, in many ways, sort of guides me. And really what that means is that I know instinctively as I'm writing what's sounding true and what's sounding false. At the end of it is when I look at it and go, oh, this one's about a kid who's 10 years old, and the language and the concepts are of that ilk. This is probably for a kid of that age.
Yeah.
But I've written stories that have had protagonists of that similar age that are absolutely adult stories, because of the language used and the narrative and so forth. So it's really only in the development of the story that you begin to get a feel for where this might end up. At least for myself, because I don't plot. I'm a total pantser. I generally find out what's happening to the characters about a page before they do. So it's as the plot and as the narrative is developing that I begin to get a feel for where this is going to end up in the marketplace.
Earlier on, you mentioned Master Puppet, who was the creation of Magret, and is sort of plays the role of a quite censorious inner voice. And I'm interested in your use of the inner voice, in writing for children, because conceptually that could potentially be quite challenging for them to understand.
Yes, I think Master Puppet's an interesting character again, because he sort of came to me as he was being written. Master Puppet is Magret's friend and mentor and protector. He's also a skeleton that she built from all the other skeletons in the graveyard. So there's, at a certain level, I think, as you're an adult reading, you think, this kid actually pulled bones out of other graves and sticks and tin cans and built herself a skeleton. But he's also that adult voice that she can react against. Because the story is about one child in an enclosed space. There's no real environment for her to act against or act across. There's no physical antagonist to come in and play a role. Magret, the baby, is a baby, so he really doesn't have any narrative drive. So there had to be someone for her to act against, to create a sense of conflict. And as a child, the grown-up world, the world of rules and laws and restrictions that you don't necessarily understand and you don't necessarily have a voice in, but it's for your own good and you'll understand when you're older, I guess it's a natural conflict. And he represents that. I think I said at one stage he represents all the thoughts that she knows are bad but she doesn't understand. you know.
Yeah.
And,
I was curious when I saw that you did a session at the Perth Writers' Festival and that you took along a whole lot of stuff to make Master Puppet with the kids who attended the session.
We built a skeleton. Yeah.
My reflection was that, so how did you explain Master Puppet to start off with? You know, were they receptive to that idea?
Yeah, I think the kids love it, and I think kids love things that are a little bit creepy or icky or
Yeah.
you know, ooky or so forth. So it was funny that I pulled out this big haversack of basketballs and pogo sticks and cricket stumps and boxing gloves and all sorts of weird stuff that I just sort of hoovered up from my garage, and said to the kids, right, we're going to build a skeleton. I'm going to read about Master Puppet, and then we're going to build one. And the kids just dove in. They loved it. And of course, as we're pulling things out of the haversack, pulling out the basketball and going, what's that? Immediately, skull. Oh, there you go. What's this? Leg. There's yours.
The pogo stick's a genius idea, actually.
The kids I think they just loved that. And kids love to create, and I don't think they have any fear or any boundaries when it comes to creating. This is a class of person that loves dinosaurs and ghosts, and as long as their imagination's being sparked, they're in for it.
Yeah. So that must have been one of the first times you've been at a writers' festival as a children's author.
That was the first time I'd been at a writers' festival as a children's author. Yeah.
How was it?
The pressure to remember not to swear is immense. I'm such a sweary person in my private life. It's fabulous. I love working with kids. Always have. Because they're fearless. They just. If you tell them something's all right, let's go have a crack at this. They're right there with you. We learn fear, and I think we learn creative fear as we get older. I find when I do workshops for adults, if you have to work a little bit harder to get them to pretend to be a Lego minifigure or
in front of other people.
In front of other people, yeah. Whereas kids, they just jump in.
Yeah.
So it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
And you're in the process of writing another children's book.
I am, yes. Something that's nominally called Ghost Tracks at the moment. And that's about a young boy who buys into the whole idea of putting a penny on the track and derails a ghost train, and then has to go to the ghost world and face the consequences of that.
Earlier on you alluded to the fact that writing a children's book kind of excited you because it was something different, and you'd spoken to me earlier about how you're inspired by polymaths like Spike Milligan, and I've reflected since then on what else might be brewing in there in your inner polymath about other things that you might like to explore, whether it's literary or something quite different.
Yeah, I next off after Ghost Tracks, so the next project's a crime novel that I've had bubbling away. I've got a collection of linked stories all set in the southwest of WA, taking various historical events and giving them a supernatural bent. So it's almost a collection of sort of supernatural horror stories. I think they'll all end up being horrible. I love to work in comic books. I've been a comic book reader since I was 5 or 6, never stopped. So, I'm also in my spare time an AFOL, an adult fan of Lego, so I'm pitching some articles to a Lego magazine as well.
Great.
So,
lots going on.
Lots of different things, and that's the joy. And I tend to feel a little bit of a bit of a beret wearer when I say about being an artist. We don't tend to think of authors as artists anymore. But I do feel like an artist, and I feel that I can't paint, I can't draw, I can't sculpt. So words are what the only thing that I'm good enough to use to create art. And why should we be limited? Art is about expression. It's not about being in one form or one genre. So, kids' books are a lot of fun, but so is science fiction, and so is crime, and so is Lego, and
so much imagination to delve into.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I always ask for a recommendation from whoever I'm speaking to on Cover to Cover for a West Australian author, and you're recommending someone I hadn't heard of before. Yes,
Stephen Dedman, local science fiction, fantasy and horror author. Stephen's been a friend and mentor of me for many, many years. I would have actually come along and recommended his latest novel, North of the Dragonlands, which has just come out by Satellite Press, but I haven't finished reading it yet. So I'm actually going to pick this one up. This is called Never Seen by Waking Eyes. It's a short story collection from Stephen. It's a couple of years old now. Coming out from an American publisher called Prime Books. Stephen has an amazing ability to incorporate the fantastical into an everyday experience. He and another author who works across a range of genres. In this particular collection, there is supernatural horror stories, romance, crime. Just an author who is absolutely gripping in so many different directions. He's a joy to read. So.
As are you. Congratulations on Magret. It really is a beautiful read, and it really felt like a nice time that we it felt like a destination every night while we were reading it. So thank you for that, and thank you so much for joining me on Cover to Cover.
Thank you, it's been a real pleasure.
The For Readers section of our website contains the book club notes for Magret and all the other books we've discovered on the program. If you'd like to receive them directly to your inbox each month, then sign up for our book club e-newsletter via the subscribe link. It's a free service and is available to any book group. If you don't have a local bookshop where you can buy the books we discuss on Cover to Cover, then you can buy them from Crow Books in Perth. Mention the code Cover to Cover when you place your order by phone and you'll get the postage free. Next month on Cover to Cover, I'll meet Michelle Michoud Crawford to discuss her debut collection of short stories, Leaving Elvis and Other Stories. These linked tales explore the consequences of the secrets, actions and unspoken experiences of 3 generations of one family. We really appreciate you sending in your feedback about Cover to Cover. To share your thoughts, you can contact Writing WA via the email address shown on the screen. Thanks for joining me again this month. We hope you're enjoying meeting West Australian authors and hearing about their work. Enjoy reading local and see you next time.